Hi. Well, actually, we're back at the cemetery again. So I'm glad you could be with us this morning. I can't be, I'm in Spokane right now. But why we're at the cemetery will become apparent in just a few minutes, I think. So let me explain what I'm doing here. First, let's not start there. Let's do this. You'll figure this out as we go along. I gotta check something here really quick. Oh yeah, okay, so we're recording. Did you know that Jesus only mentioned the names of 4 prophets from the Old Testament? Only 4 prophets. Do you know who the 4 prophets are? I'll give you 30 seconds to kind of think that through, and I'll keep looking around here at this cemetery that's very bedecked for Memorial Day, which is why you have all the spinners and stuff like that. So, who are the 4 prophets? Give up yet? Well, one natural guess is Isaiah, because Isaiah gets quoted so much. So he's one of the 4. Another one of the 4 is, it's Elijah, who we've been studying. And that sort of makes sense. He was kind of the big kingpin of the prophets in the Old Testament. Another one, surprisingly enough, is Elisha, who we've also been studying, who was the successor to Elijah. And, in terms of pound for pound, the crazy stuff that he did and how God used him, even more than Elijah in many respects. The 4th one, it's a surprise to most people. It's Jonah. Jonah. Isaiah, Elijah, Elisha, Jonah. Those are the 4 names. Now, why would Jesus mention Jonah? Because as we've been looking at him so far, he's kind of he's probably not the most respected and the most qualified and the most accomplished of all the prophets. In fact, he seems to be the opposite. But Jesus does, and he uses them in an extraordinarily important way. Let me read it for you. I'm going to go to Matthew 16 right here and read for you. It says, Matthew 16 verse 4, "And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show him a sign from heaven. Show us a sign from heaven." Now, this was not so much so that their flagging belief could be increased. It was really just to test him. They wanted to see, put up or shut up. Do something really great right now so you can show us that you really are who you claim to be. So Jesus doesn't play into their hands. There's a lot of wind here in the morning at the cemetery. Wow. Jesus doesn't play into their hands. Instead, he answered them, "Well, when it's evening, you say it'll be fair weather, and for the sky is red. And in the morning," verse 3, "it'll be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." And what he's saying to them quite clearly is, you don't need proof of who I am or where I've come from or my qualifications. You know enough. Your problem is not knowledge about what's going on. Your problem is the willingness to believe who I am. You're just making me or asking me to prove who I am when I don't really need any proof, because you know better already. You have already been warned. And then he says an incredible thing in verse 4. He says, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." So he left them and departed. The sign of Jonah? What is the sign of Jonah? Well, that's a really good question. I mean, when you think about the life of Jonah that you know so far, it doesn't seem to be that there's much to use when you're trying to interpret the sign of Jonah. But they understood what he was saying. He could immediately just reference a passage in the Old Testament, for instance, and they would know exactly what he's talking about. So they pull up in their memory Jonah. Well, what was the deal with Jonah? Jonah was the reluctant prophet who eventually did go off and do what God asked him to do, but he was a reluctant man. Is the sign of Jonah reluctance? No. But Jesus is saying, I will give you a sign as the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah. I'm sure they went away kind of scratching their heads thinking, well, I know Jonah, but what kind of sign are you going to give us that's miraculous? Wait a second. in the life of Jonah, there's only one miraculous thing that happens, really. And that miraculous thing is the fact that he gets thrown into the water and should have died for sure, being pitched into the water. I mean, that's a place you don't get out of alive, and get taken down to the depths and down the pits to the belly of Sheol, as Jonah himself said, and he was saved from that. So Jesus is saying to us, the only sign he's going to give us is a rescue from death? Well, it's not the only time that they challenged him like this. Earlier in Matthew, they had already done it once before. The Pharisees and the scribes this time, instead of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they'd done it once before, and Jesus explains himself just a little bit better, just in case they weren't sure what was going on. Here it is in Matthew 12, verse 38. Then some of the scribes and the Pharisees answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, same line again. "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." That's it, the prophet Jonah's sign. And then he explains, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Okay, so it's more clear here. But I think the other guys probably picked it up as well. The point is that Jesus says, I'm not going to kowtow to your demand for signs. The other guys, he told him, you already knew, you should know enough to know. You don't have to do that. You're just asking proof from me. But I will give you one proof. I will give you one sign. And that's the sign of Jonah. And the sign of Jonah is that he was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And in the same way, the Son of Man, Jesus, will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And then, of course, the conclusion of that isn't death, certain death for Jonah, which was changed by God's interaction, and not certain death for Jesus. That is not long-term death. So there's death for Jesus. There's the certainty of going to a place that we as humans cannot change, as Jonah said, going through the gates into Sheol, and then the gates are barred behind us and closed, and there's nothing you can do to resist that. That's just the way things work here. But he's saying it didn't work that way for Jonah, because God interceded in the process of his death. And in the same way, Jesus says, that's the sign I'll give to you. God will intercede in my death. Well, they never did ask for another sign, I don't think. Different groups did, and they said, if you're really the hot stuff that you say you are, you should be able to prove it to us and make it easy for us. Interestingly enough, in the world, those kind of proofs don't really work in terms of changing people's sense of belief. And you think it would. I mean, a lot of atheists today will say, your God seems to be pretty cagey. Why doesn't he just come out and do something really miraculous? And I'll believe. I'll see it and go, yeah, there it is. There it is. But when it comes to believing and putting your trust and yielding to who Jesus is, it's just not that simple. It doesn't work that way. Because we will end up believing what we want to believe and nothing else. Do you remember that story that Jesus told about Lazarus and the rich man? How they both died. Lazarus went up to Abraham's bosom, the rich man down to hell, down to Sheol, the holding place before the day of judgment. That's basically what the definition of Sheol is, where you go before the one day of judgment for all mankind. Well, you remember the story, but in the end, the rich man says, can you just send someone, maybe if you send someone from here who comes from the dead, and I can warn my family and tell them that this is a real place and they need to be more careful. And Abraham, who he's talking to at the time in this story, says, that even won't be very helpful. It won't really work. And he says to him at the end of the passage, this is in Luke 16, verse 30, the rich man is saying, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. They will repent. And he said to them, well, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, that is what's written in the Bible, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. It's just not that convincing. When people believe what they want to believe, even someone rising from the dead won't change their mind. And indeed, that's exactly what happened when Jesus died, was buried, and raised again 3 days later, is that people still would not take the evidence of someone who comes up from what should be a one-way trip to death and oblivion, and he comes back to life. That's a proof of the fact that whoever this happened to is connected to someone who's outside of this world, because inside this world, we can't change that. You start that path to death and you go there, and it's a one-way trip. But with Jesus, we find that it's God himself who raises up the dead. God himself is the one who restores those, as Jonah says, who brought my life up from the pit. The certainty of a place that you cannot return from, but God himself can do that on our behalf when he loves us. You brought my life up from the pit. And of course, in all of this we've been talking about, there's so much more in the Psalms even about the fact that David has sort of a type of who Jesus is. He even writes a psalm that prefigures what all this is going to go about. And the psalm isn't so much about him, it's about Jesus. Because it says in Psalm 16:10, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." And that's exactly what's happening when we talk about the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah is the fact that even though sin and death are part of our experience, Jesus, our pioneer out of this place, will bring our life up from the pit, and he himself will keep our lives from corruption just like himself. We die with him and we're raised with him. And in the end, then, you can say the same words as what Jonah said at the end of his prayer. And these are powerful words. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So that's the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah, very simply, is the fact that there is a way beyond death through the salvation that God brings. That's such a New Testament message, and it's an Old Testament message. Jesus says, if you're looking for a sign, the only one you really need is the sign of Jonah, who, when he was going down to the pit and into the belly of Sheol, was saved by the grace of God, not because of anything he did on his own, but because of God's gracious love instead. That is really good news. Well, enjoy the cemetery in its Memorial Day splendor. And I'll be back with you next week. And we're going into Jonah 3 next week, so take a look at that. It'll be a great time. Jonah is a very unexpected, unassuming little book. But if Jesus is going to single out Jonah to illustrate the single most powerful truth about who he is, the only necessary sign anyone needs is prefigured through Jonah, and then is lived out in the flesh through Jesus, who was fully man, fully God, who died and rose again, because salvation comes from the Lord. Okay, we'll see you next week. Love you all. Bye-bye. Didn't turn off. Now it will.